Hi, I'm Tommy, and I'm a professional paleontologist. By day, I use the latest data science techniques to reconstruct ecological and evolutionary changes from the fossil record. But by night, I investigate cryptids, the paranormal, mediumship, the occult, politics, history, philosophy, and even God himself. You know, all the things that good little scientists are supposed to avoid. If you want to join me on my journey, friend, be so kind as to like and subscribe. And welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. Hi, folks. So, it's finals week at the university where I work. So I'm doing another short video that's tangentially related to the Autism Awareness Month theme. And I know that Autism Awareness Month has ended, but I have two more important videos that I want to do on that topic. And that's going to have to wait until after finals week when I can really put forward some work on those videos. But until those videos are done, I'm still going to keep on the theme of Autism Awareness Month. So I want to talk about in this video why I'm a postmodernist in the philosophical sense. And I mean that in the broad sense, not as an endorsement of any particular philosopher identified with the movement. And this will wrap back around to Autism Awareness Month at the end, I promise. Before I explain what postmodernism is and why I agree with it, I need to explain what postmodernism is not, because there's a whole bunch of people out there promoting straw men of postmodernism for ideological purposes. Postmodernism is not performativity theory, the idea that gender is purely a social construction. I've done a whole video on that now, explaining the problem with performativity theory, but the short version is that it has more to do with that movement's roots in the discredited psychological theory of behaviorism than it does with postmodernism. Though postmodernism does criticize social aspects of gender roles, so for example, if a person says, real men don't wear dresses, the postmodernist will point to a Scotsman. Postmodernism is also not intersectionalism. Intersectionalism is a reactionary ideology, and for the conspiracy theorists in the back, it's an anti-Marxist ideology too. It rejects the primacy of class in favor of a, quote, matrix of oppression in which racism, sexism, and homophobia are independent of each other, though have a related ontology. You know, where Marxism teaches that all forms of oppression are manifestations of the one, class oppression. The practical implication of intersectionalism is to delegitimize the suffering of poor workers who belong to otherwise privileged groups. So, for example, white privilege exists to delegitimize the suffering of poor white people as being not oppressed enough. Intersectionalism is controlled opposition promoted by the ruling class to divide the working class using the language of anti-racism, rather than, their usual racist rhetoric that they use to divide the working class. Ever notice how woke people tend to be wealthy, well-educated, usually white liberals? Yeah, that's not an accident. Wokeness also allows wealthy people from otherwise underprivileged demographics to participate in believing themselves oppressed. So it also gives those people the platform to talk down to the supposedly privileged poor people. No, postmodernism isn't any of that. Postmodernism is the application of philosophical skepticism to systematic thinking, which is the foundation of modernism. And postmodernism has an emphasis in that skepticism on the social aspects of these systems that people tend to ignore. So I think perhaps an example would be helpful here. As a professional scientist, I'm often asked why I'm so critical of science, which to me is like asking why a professional chef no longer eats at the fancy restaurant where he used to work. He knows how the salmon is made. So let's take a look at the postmodern criticism of science, because it's what I know best, and because postmodern critiques of science tend to inspire a lot of vitriol. Realist accounts of science claim we can use evidence to know objective truths about reality. Our truths might be refined with time, but are generally sensu lato accurate. So Newtonian physics is broad sense correct, but became more accurate when relativity was added, and it will presumably be, on the realist view, even more correct whenever the unified theory is added, whatever that ends up being. So science counts as a unifying system that we think can give us objective truth about reality, and it's an inseparable part of our modern world. So it's a prime candidate for postmodern critique. Science, though, is far from rational. I've talked before about the philosophical problems with science. The Raven paradox, the problem with falsification, the many problems of induction, and the philosophical and scientific problems with naturalism. I won't rehash those here. I think science is just as irrational as most modernists out there think religion is. But we live in a society which has this obsessive veneration of science, and the Overton window is such that these criticisms come off as cuckoo. So society shields science from intellectually honest criticism. But that's not all. See, we might say that science in its ideal or Platonic form is flawed, but the way science works in the real world is imperfect too. There are barriers to who gets to do science, and experiments are expensive, so funding gets to dictate a lot of what science actually gets done. And I've talked at length before about the documented problems with peer-reviewed publication, from open and acknowledged bias to the crisis of replicability. And so, of course, there's a moral dimension to this too, because we use science to try to guide policy. And when a marginalized group objects to policy, they may be swimming against the tide of established science. They can't afford the expensive science that might support them. So the obvious example of this is the gay community before the 1970s, who are pathologized by the medical establishment. And here's where it wraps back around to autism, because we are in the same boat as the gay community in the 1960s. We are pathologized and lack the funding to define ourselves scientifically. For ABA survivors like myself, who want ABA to be banned, we are swimming against the tide of a scientific consensus that tells us that ABA is good for us. All we had to advocate for ourselves, for our position, were personal testimonials and logical criticisms of the studies. And fortunately, we are, as the stereotype implies, pretty good at logic. It's only been in recent years, and I'm talking like the last 3 years, that we've had studies documenting the serious side effects of ABA. And only this past year did we have studies that finally started to call into question the efficacy of ABA. None of these studies were conducted by autistic people, and that really big Department of Defense ABA study was conducted with the motivation of cutting services to autistic people. So yes, autistic people are actively being oppressed by science. And in a society that didn't actively fetishize science the way ours does, the moral arguments and the testimonials would have been enough to ban ABA. In fact, it was enough to discredit conversion therapy, and our hope is that one day, someday soon, ABA will be similarly discredited. Anti-ABA activists can provide evidence that ABA is harmful, but we shouldn't have to. Our word should be good enough when it comes to what's done to us. I've often heard in response to postmodern critique of science that we lack the balls to posit an alternative to science, that we stop being postmodernists when we're sick and need medicine, for example. So let me be so bold as to offer 2 replacements for science. The first is an instrumentalist view of science. According to this view, science only seeks to make useful projections of data without making appeals to truth, or more practically, refrain from making policy recommendations. The second alternative is math. Look, data is distinct from evidence. Data is just quantified observation, while evidence implied that we're trying to get at the truth of something. So evidence for something, evidence against something. Predicting new data from old data is purely a mathematical process and doesn't require a conceptual model, and it doesn't make a claim of truth. Conceptual models were necessary when that math was being done by the meat computers, but now we have actual computers, like neural net AIs don't understand the underlying conceptual model. They're just running an optimization algorithm. Like, we're very close to the day when computers will be able to predict protein folding, which is the holy grail of biochemistry, without actually understanding how proteins fold. Okay, we're almost done. I just want to talk real quick about how postmodernism relates to Marxism. I've only talked about my politics a few times explicitly, but I'm a Marxist-Leninist. And the tradition within Marxist-Leninism that I resonate with most is Minism, or Ho Chi Minh thought, the political philosophy of the Communist Party of Vietnam and of its late leader Ho Chi Minh. This will be relevant momentarily. Postmodernism and Marxism, in its original formulation, are incompatible, because Marxism is one of those totalizing systems that modernism loves so much. But Marx's ideas have been criticized from within Marxism along postmodernist lines almost from the beginning. Marx loved economics and viewed everything through that lens, to the exclusion of, say, ideology as a significant factor. And this has been criticized by the likes of Antonio Gramsci and Georges Sorel. Both acknowledged that there was a very real role for ideology to play in class struggle. And look, Marx was also a relatively well-off, well-educated white guy from a liberal background, living in two imperialist nations while working for a company based in a third. Many subsequent Marxists have criticized his unwillingness to criticize liberalism enough, and many in the Leninist camp specifically criticized Marx's blind spot when it comes to the colonialized of the Third World, which has of course also been a part of the Minist tradition as well as the Maoist tradition and many other tendencies within Marxist-Leninism. Finally, I just want to say a brief word about postmodernism and religion. Postmodern theology and Christian existentialism played a role in my conversion from atheism to deism. It wasn't that I was waiting for evidence and found some. It's that I realized that science was just another bullshit religion, and that broke the dam. I realized that my beliefs weren't any more rational than anyone else's. So I think there is a liberating and equalizing effect in postmodern thought. So that's all for now, friends. Take care.